Great. Thanks ever so much, Ginny. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and also thanks to Jan for coordinating in the last couple of weeks to organise this. So today I'm going to be talking, as Janine said, about the genomic turn in studies in the origins and identities of enslaved Africans who were displaced by the transatlantic slave trade. So to give you a bit of background, throughout the 20th century, anthropologists and historians have been interested in whether and to what extent it's possible to reconstruct the ethnic origins of African descendant American and Afro-Caribbean populations. Recuperating the cultural identities that were effaced by transatlantic slavery has been seen as a way of restoring a sense of dignity and individuality to its historical victims, but also a way of undoing some of the collective psychological trauma that was inflicted by and continues to be inflicted by racial ideologies, which aim to sort human groups into hierarchies based on physical attributes such as skin color, skull shape, blood quantum, and so on. But funnily enough, over the past 3 decades, the body has taken center stage again in efforts to reconstruct the origins and identities of historically enslaved Africans and their descendants. So this is thanks to developments in the field of molecular archaeology, in which DNA has come to be regarded as a kind of biological archive that can give special insights into human histories. So in the 1980s, geneticists created a human evolutionary tree using mitochondrial DNA, and they were able to establish through that to confirm through that all living humans have a common matrilineal ancestor who likely lived in East Africa in over 200,000 years ago. Then in the 1990s, scientists were doing a lot of huge genetic mapping projects where they were gathering DNA samples from populations around the world. The idea was to try and capture humankind's genetic diversity and use this to fill in some of the blanks about our human histories. So these databases mainly include the DNA of groups who are believed to know their own genealogies and origins going back several generations at least, and these are used in attempts to shed light on the origins of populations who have been subject to recent migrations and admixtures, as well as kind of historical and cultural traumas. And the African diaspora is one case in point. And these techniques more recently, since the early 2000s, have also been adopted by companies selling personalized DNA ancestry tests, which often present genetics as a source of identity and self-knowledge. And this in turn has led to renewed debates about the relationship between identity and biology, the limits and potential of what our DNA can reveal about our ancestry and even about our ethnicity or race. So the work that I'm presenting to you here today draws partly on an upcoming paper that I co-wrote with my colleague Hannes Schroeder from the University of Copenhagen. I worked with him on 2 previous research networks, and he's a specialist in evolutionary genomics and Caribbean archaeology, and that paper is going to be out in Current Anthropology later this year. It's also some research that is based on a chapter of a book that I've been working on, which is currently under review and has the working title Permanent Markers, Race, Ancestry in the Body After the Genome. And all of this relates to my PhD research, which I completed in 2016, which looked broadly at how the spread of DNA ancestry technologies are impacting scientific and lay ideas about race and ethnicity in Brazil and the US. And in particular, I look at these phenomena in relation to the societal efforts to come to terms with the aftermaths of slavery. So to repair the damage that it wrought upon kinship links, but also to undo the kind of silences and gaps that it created within both family and national histories. So I'm not the first person by any means to be writing about this. My research follows on from and also works in dialogue with the research of sociologists like Alondra Nelson and Dorothy Roberts, who have also looked particularly at how these technologies have been used by African Americans in the US in particular. And I should point out that although there has been a lot of attention as well as a lot of criticism drawn to these cases of DNA kind of ethnicity testing by African descendant Americans, on a global scale, these groups really only make up a minority proportion of ancestry testing customers. Currently, it's estimated that around 30 million tests have been processed worldwide. The largest proportion of customers are actually white Americans and Europeans, or Euro-descendant Australians, and so on. And this kind of bias is also reflected in the way that many genetic data sets used by companies are skewed towards Euro-descendant populations. And the industry seems to be trying to correct this bias. But companies are still largely concentrated in the US, but there's also businesses developing in other parts of the world like China, Israel, and Brazil, among other places. So although I'm focusing on African descendant users of these technologies in this presentation today, I want to make it clear that this isn't a unique case. It's not particularly exceptional. However, I do want to highlight some of the particular issues that these cases bring up, given that they are linked to a long history of anthropological efforts to identity and reconstruct what is thought of as the survivals of African cultures and kinship patterns in the Americas. So over the past century, claims about the exceptionality of Afro-descendant cultures have been mobilized politically in different ways, both to lobby for their protection and preservation, but also to label these populations as pathological and anti-modern. So for similar reasons, discussions about the legitimacy of the science behind these DNA ancestry techniques and their potential to reintroduce biological essentialist and deterministic conceptions of race and ethnicity have been particularly heated in relation to African descendant groups. So these are groups with a history of unethical treatment and exploitation in medical and anthropological research, whose findings in turn have been used to reinforce these narratives about the biological bases of racial difference and often racial inferiority. So one prominent line of criticism by social scientists as well as geneticists has held that these DNA ancestry tests encourage people to think of identity, which in reality they say is a social construct, as intrinsically genetic. So for instance, talking about the company African Ancestry, which specializes in DNA matching Black Americans to African countries and ethnic groups. Dorothy Roberts here has argued, and I quote, "African American DNA test takers are paying for a false sense of connection to a contemporary ethnic group in Africa, a connection that could be established through other, more authentic means," end quote. And Alondra Nelson, in her work, she takes a different approach, and she focuses instead on how DNA data are socialized and incorporated selectively into people's identity claims as part of emerging biosocial and biopolitical relations that are essentialist only in a strategic sense. And similarly, in my research, my aim is kind of to avoid making normative statements about the relationships between genetics and identity. So I engage critically with the claim that DNA can tell us about the past, but I don't discount the possibility that genetic data can and do intervene in processes of identity construction and even come to be constitutive of relationships of different kinds. So in this respect, I'm interested in looking at how DNA test takers themselves assess the legitimacy of these data in relation to other forms of knowledge about the past, and also seeing how these technologies are being used to challenge the idea that little or nothing can be known about the identities and origins of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Just to give you a quick overview of the rest of the talk, I'm firstly just going to give a bit of background information about kind of background data about the use of genetics in anthropological studies of the African diaspora and the key challenges to using these data to make inferences about the ethnic identities of historic individuals. And then the second part of the talk is going to look at some case studies from my own research among individuals who've used DNA testing to try and find out about their family origins. So I'm looking at how DNA becomes kind of activated socially, and I'm also going to be calling into question the idea that these techniques are necessarily heralding a return to biological essentialism. Okay, so, and then there's going to be a discussion. Very important. The work that first pioneered the use of DNA to investigate the origins of enslaved Africans was the New York African Burial Ground Project in the 1990s. So it was a project that focused on human remains exhumed from an 18th century burial ground in New York City, which is now the site of the African Burial Ground National Monument, which you can see here. Located at the corners of Duane and Elk Streets in Lower Manhattan. And here it is pictured on an 18th century map, and here's the close-up. It says Negroes Burial Ground, just around here. So Alondra Nelson discusses the origins of this project in her book, The Social Life of DNA. Just briefly, the excavation was commissioned by the US General Services Administration ahead of the planned building of a government-owned tower building. The archaeologists began to uncover these human remains, and it's estimated that there's something like 15 to 20,000 burials at the site. And initially the plan was to do a cursory forensic examination, which would involve the standard practice of racing the skeletal remains, so basically saying whether they're of African or Caucasian origin, or that kind of basic racial labeling. But a report in the New York Times showed that the team seemed to be rushing the dig and that they were potentially damaging the remains in the process. There was a public outcry, and that was particularly led by a group who called themselves the Descendants of the African Burial Ground. And following that, a group of predominantly African-American researchers from Howard University stepped in, led by the archaeologist Michael Blakey. So Blakey's group designed a research project based on a systematic consultation with the New York African descendant community. And one of the main things they said they wanted them to do was to try and establish the individual and ancestral origins of the burial site population. So one of the things they did, they used lots of different biological and cultural, archaeological and historical techniques. And one of the things they did was to carry out mitochondrial DNA analysis. I'll go a little bit into more detail about what that is later on. So they looked at 48 of the disinterred individuals, and they found that 45 of the skeletal remains could be linked to 3 DNA lineages. So these different codes here, they describe particular mitochondrial DNA lineages, and you can see there's 3 different ones: West Central African, West Africa, Benin, Fulbe peoples, and West Africa, Niger. So this finding was pretty much what you would expect based on what we know about the transatlantic trading routes. And the researchers wrote in their report that they hadn't been able to make more precise estimates of the origins of these individuals, partly because of the severe degradation of some of the human remains. It's quite difficult to recover enough DNA to make the analyses, but also because there was a kind of paucity of appropriate African genetic reference databases at the point. You just didn't have enough DNA samples to compare to be able to get a good enough picture. But despite that, the work raised hopes for how DNA analysis might be applied in future investigations as genotyping techniques and the contents of DNA databases continue to improve. And one of the unexpected outcomes of this project was the establishment of a DNA ancestry testing company, which was founded by Rick Kittles, who you can see here, who was one of the geneticists hired to develop the technique for estimating the biogeographical origins of the burial ground population. So Kittles co-founded this company, African Ancestry, with an entrepreneur, Gina Page, in 2003. And they used similar methods that Kittles had been pioneering for the African burial ground, but for living African Americans, which was actually, in a sense, easier because you didn't have to deal with very degraded DNA samples. You could just get a saliva sample or a cheek swab, and that made that aspect of things much easier. So the company, what it still does to this day is to analyze customers' mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome sequences. I don't want to get deep into the technicalities of the genetics, but for anyone who's not that familiar, your mitochondrial DNA is part of your DNA that is inherited matrilineally. So it follows this pink line on this genealogical diagram. And I apologize for the very gendered colors here. Then Y chromosome DNA is basically the same on the male line. So they're just two parts of your DNA. They don't represent the entirety of your genomic inheritance, but they allow you to trace these two specific genealogical lineages. So they basically look at these two parts of the genome, and they compare them with their proprietary database of DNA lineages collected from contemporary African populations, mainly from places that were affected by the transatlantic slave trade. And then based on the closest DNA match or matches, the company provides clients with a certificate of ancestry, and this is an example of one that's shown on their website, and it says here, your name shares maternal genetic ancestry with, and then it'll tell you the name of one or more ethnic groups and countries where they found similar DNA or matching DNA lineages. So I'll come back to this a little bit later. But another one of the groups, one of the scientific projects that was also inspired by the work done at the New York African Burial Ground was the EuroTAS project, which is an EU funded training network, which ran from 2012 to 2015, which I was one of the PhD research fellows on. This is me right here. So the project brought together an international team of researchers to look at the historical and biological legacies of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans from multi- and interdisciplinary perspectives. So these are, you hopefully can just about make them out. These are descriptions of some of the projects within the network. So many of my colleagues were using DNA techniques as well as other bioarchaeological methods like isotope analysis to try and estimate the origins of both historic enslaved Africans, so that's using archaeological remains, and also living African descendant populations throughout the Atlantic region. And my project, which is this one down here, was meant to provide a kind of reflection on the sociopolitical dynamics and repercussions of taking these kinds of genetic approaches to exploring identity. So I looked at the methods that are being used by geneticists who are doing similar projects in the US and Brazil, the way they categorize their data and communicate their findings in scientific papers and communications with journalists, what they define as acceptable or unacceptable interpretations of the data, I also looked at how these types of studies are mobilized in public debates around, particularly around issues like affirmative actions, for example, in the case of Brazil, and in the case of US, how they've been commercialized and sold as a product as part of this kind of market of identity in the US. And finally, I also interviewed DNA test takers in both of those countries about their personal experiences with the data, so how they interpreted them, how they incorporate them or not into their sense of personal identity and their understanding of their family histories. And one of the things that I found was that both scientists and members of the public come across some of the same problems when they're trying to use genetic data to make inferences about the ethnic and geographic origins of historic or living individuals, so potentially your ancestors or of yourself. On the methodological level, DNA does have certain limitations in terms of what it can tell us about the past. So as I just mentioned, mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA analyses have an advantage as a way of tracing ancestry because they don't change very much from generation to generation. So the mitochondrial DNA that this person has is the same that his great-great-grandmother and so on as you go into the past has, and the same applies on the Y chromosome for the male lineage. But the disadvantage is that this technique only really tells us about two very specific lineages and not about the whole of our ancestry. Now there's other types of DNA tests, these are actually more common, called admixture tests or autosomal tests, which look at DNA from all across the genome. So DNA that's inherited from all of our direct ancestors, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. And this chart just kind of shows, if you maybe think back to your high school biology, you may remember learning about genetic inheritance. So you receive half of your genome from each of your parents, half again, so a quarter from each of your grandparents, and that gets halved at each generation. So on the one hand, it means that by this kind of technique, you can look at a kind of summary of the DNA you've received from lots of direct ancestors. But on the downside, because DNA is lost at each generation, you get progressively smaller and fewer fragments of DNA the further you go back in terms of your genealogical tree. So by looking, and this is just to give you an example of the kind of tests that you can buy on the internet today. This is one by Ancestry DNA. This is an example of what those results look like, and essentially by looking at these characteristic markers across your genome, scientists can say something about how frequently these markers appear among populations around the world, and they use this to estimate the populations of your ancestors. But these are only snapshots, and the accuracy of the estimate will also be influenced by which markers you study, how many, how much, what proportion of your genome you're looking at, the contents of the reference database. So here they're looking at specific African populations, but there's lots of bits here that they're kind of missing out. So those are just sort of very briefly some of the limitations of these tests for looking at personal ancestry. But then with regards to using DNA specifically as an estimate of ethnicity, in this case, the ethnic origins of individuals who were displaced historically by the transatlantic slave trade, there are various other epistemic and historical issues to take into account. So a conventional definition of an ethnic group, which I'm taking from Hutchinson and Smith's 1996 book, which is called Ethnicity, I quote, a named human population with myths of common ancestry, shared historical memories, one or more elements of common culture, a link with a homeland, and a sense of solidarity among at least some of its members. So in this definition, the notion of common ancestry can denote, although it doesn't have to, an element of genetic connectivity. So given that some ethnic groups observe culturally instituted mating behaviors, including degrees of endogamy, that can structure patterns of mate selection and reproduction, and cause the accumulation of particular genetic variants within a given human group, especially if that group has been isolated over time, for example. So given what we know about the history of the transatlantic slave trade, when we compare the genomes of African descendant Americans and West African populations, for example, it's not that much of a surprise that we do see common patterns of genetic variation, and that we can take this as evidence of a shared ancestral link dating back to slavery. On the other hand, I think it's too much of a simplification to automatically equate a DNA match to a shared ethnic identity, even though, as you can see, this word ethnicity is often used by DNA ancestry companies. It's become a bit of a buzzword. It's the word they use to describe the product that they're giving to their customers. But there are problems. There's the problem of historicity. So when we're looking at ancient remains, for example, scientists are trying to estimate the origins of people who lived in the 18th century, but they are only able to compare those DNA sequences to living populations, because we currently don't have enough historical African DNA samples to create a proper ancient DNA reference database. So you're comparing people who are living in different times. We have to take into account the fact that populations may move around, they mix, they change in terms of who's there and who's gone elsewhere over time. Some historians argue that the experience of colonization and the very slave trade likely altered African concepts of kinship in a fundamental way. And some have even gone as far to say that contemporary African ethnic groups can be referred to as colonial inventions. For example, referring to the way that European colonial administrators and anthropologists mapped native peoples and tried to make them out to be these discrete, bounded entities rather than dynamic and historically interlocking networks. And then there's also the fact that in the Americas as well, conceptions of ethnicity were changed by these processes of forced migration and plantation slavery. There's some evidence that different ethnonyms were being used in the same time periods in by Africans in the Americas versus by Africans in Africa, which could be a sign of new modes of ethnic affiliation emerging in plantation societies. And although you do get these African ethnic clusters persisting in parts of the Americas, over time these have been challenged by cultural and biological processes of creolization, mixture, racialization, and so on. And sometimes this could form part of survival strategies, and creating new collective identities was also something that happened during and since slavery. So what we're seeing essentially is very complex ethnic histories with continuities and ruptures on both sides of the Atlantic, and that makes it difficult to draw a straight line between the identities of African and African descendant groups today and those of their ancestors several centuries ago. And of course, we also have to remember that biogenetic concepts of ancestry aren't universally constitutive of ethnic belonging. So contemporary African ethnic groups designate affiliation through different mechanisms, and sometimes clan affiliation relies on particular lineage rules like matrilineality or patrilineality, and things like property ownership, marriage, naming conventions can all be essential to confirming an individual's membership in an ethnic community. So it's not just down to who you're genetically related to. On the other hand, it's also true that social identities are relations produced by their social and historical contexts, and in this sense, it's plausible that DNA tests may already be becoming considered as a new type of ethnic marker, or something that can be taken into account when determining a person's ethnic belonging. So I'm now going to move on to the second part of my talk and look at how these ideas and claims about ethnic belonging play out in the experiences of DNA test takers who are searching for their own family origins prior to slavery. For my PhD fieldwork back in 2013 and 14, I interviewed 100 DNA ancestry test takers from Brazil and the US. Most of them identified as Black, mixed race, or white. And I was asking them specifically about their kind of attitudes towards African ancestry, but also about generally why they'd taken the test, what they actually did with the results, and what were their impacts on their ideas about their racial and ethnic identity and about their family history. So in the US, the people I interviewed had fairly different backgrounds in both countries. In the US, there is this established DNA ancestry testing market. Lots of people I interviewed there had bought themselves one or more DNA tests online from a range of companies. Sometimes they've been given it as a gift by a friend or relative. In the US, on the other hand, there's until just the last couple of years, there hasn't really been a commercial DNA testing market, but there have been a lot of scientific projects about Brazilian ancestry, usually framed in the sense of the mixture between Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans. So the people I interviewed were mostly volunteers in a study, one of these studies about the dynamics of admixture in Brazil. But I also spoke to some people who'd taken part in a TV documentary that used DNA tests to trace their African ancestry, and this is the sample that I'll be talking about later in this talk. But in general, people choose to take DNA ancestry tests for many reasons. This is partly sort of culturally determined and determined by the market itself. So I'm sure that some of you will probably have seen adverts yourself for DNA testing companies. There are these big companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and MyHeritage, among others. A lot of the time, their publicity material focuses on the admixture tests, this kind that sort of gives you a set of percentages, which I showed you earlier, and they're presented as a way to uncover your ethnic origins, or just to find out who you are. And the implication is usually that learning about your genetic origins should have radical impacts for your sense of social identity and even your sense of self. And there has been some tendency in the academic literature to see these tests as somewhat frivolous. They used to be referred to as recreational genomics, or the idea that they're really tapping into these narcissistic tendencies, that they allow people to take up new ethnic identities in rather a tokenistic way. But I found from my research that there are also many people who are using DNA tests as a tool to further their existing family history research. And in fact, this was why some of the early DNA ancestry testing companies were set up in the early 2000s. Increasingly, many companies are integrating DNA services with existing genealogy collections, like Ancestry.com, which is the owner of Ancestry DNA. MyHeritage, similarly, they're these companies that have these big archival collections, and now they're integrating that with DNA to allow people to triangulate these different kinds of data and pursue their their family history research in a slightly different way. And I think this is the way the industry is going to continue in future. So in her study of genetic genealogical practices among people of Irish descent, the geographer Catherine Nash has said that genealogy today is, I cite, a practice that is both self-centered and collective, both individualized and relational. It's fueled by a desire to know oneself through a family past and the appeal of making connections, of finding relatives, joining up family trees. And it's true that many genealogists enjoy the thrill of the detective work, of painstakingly collecting clues and tracking down long-lost relatives to piece together their family history. Genealogy has also been called a practice of making relations, which can involve reclaiming lost ties with living kin. But as Fenella Cannell, who's an anthropologist who studies genealogical practices in England, as she's pointed out, genealogy can also be a form of emotional labor. It can be a way of caring for the dead and of, in her words, keeping sets of kinship relations available for their potential future use. So genealogy has also had a particular significance for members of the African diaspora. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Alex Haley's best-selling autobiographical novel and TV miniseries Roots from the 1970s, which inspired a generation of African Americans to try and learn about their own family histories of slavery, which even in the 1950s and 60s was still a taboo subject within many African American families. Of course, the climax of Haley's story was his genealogical breakthrough that led him to a village in the Gambia where one of his enslaved ancestors, Kunta Kinte, was thought to have originated 2 centuries earlier. And many African-American genealogists have tried to emulate this feat. But those that do try to do this often are faced with specific historiographical challenges. For example, most enslaved people were illiterate. They weren't allowed to learn to read or write, so very few left written accounts of their lives. The fact that there were systemic sexual relations between white slaveholders and enslaved women, which makes it hard to recover reliable identification about paternal lineages. There's a replacement of African names for a slave name upon their arrival in North America, which makes it difficult to make that, even if you manage to trace your lineage all the way back to your first ancestor who arrived from a slave ship, it's then very difficult to actually make the connection with their origins in African societies. But having said that, in the past few decades, the resources that are available to genealogists have expanded hugely, thanks to the growth of these genealogy companies I was mentioning, who make their archives available online, usually in turn for subscription fees. And also social networks have had a huge impact as well, just the fact that people are able to contact each other instantly and share information. All of this is having a big impact. In Brazil, on the other hand, this kind of infrastructure in terms of having big genealogy companies or collections of genealogical archives online is really nowhere near at the same place. And family history research is also quite uncommon as a pastime, except among very kind of privileged and often white families. There's also additional historical barriers in comparison to the US. So many Brazilian documents relating to slavery were burnt shortly after abolition to avoid claims for indemnity from slave owners. And this simultaneously destroyed important records that could have been useful for tracing Afro-Brazilian family lines. The maintenance of oral histories relating to slavery and African family origins was also seriously eroded by the spread of eugenic theories of racial whitening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which aimed to gradually purge Brazil of its black populations through strategies of incentivized European immigration and sustained racial mixing. So, for example, in her book, racism in a racial democracy. Franz Wundantz's Twine showed that these whitening ideologies were still alive and well, even in the 1990s, among working-class Afro-Brazilian families in rural Rio de Janeiro. So Twine observed that her informants used several strategies to whiten their family lineages in a kind of retrospective fashion. So, for instance, they avoided naming Black ancestors when telling oral histories. They showed only light-skinned relatives and acquaintances in the family portraits decorating their living rooms. And to try and counteract all of that cultural weight of this whitening ideology, Afro-Brazilian activist and cultural groups are encouraging Black Brazilians to try and find out about their family histories, mainly actually as a way of just realizing how that ideology impacts on the way histories are remembered or kind of forgotten. Although in general, there's not much emphasis on actually trying to trace those lineages all the way back to Africa, which is just seen as pretty much impossible by a lot of people. But DNA ancestry tests may be seen as a breakthrough in this respect because they don't depend on written sources or the maintenance of oral histories. And while there are lots of DNA ancestry tests available on the market these days, and as I said, most of them are these admixture tests, many of the DNA testers that I interviewed who had been trying to trace their African lineages tended to prefer the types of tests offered by African Ancestry, these lineage tests that only look at two specific parts of your family tree. So even though these aren't either the cheapest tests on the market, and they're also not the most technologically developed, they only refer to a specific part of your family tree, they are among the few companies that provide clients with a match to a named African ethnic group in a country rather than just a genetic region. So based on this information, some test takers organise what have become known as roots tours to go and visit their family's ancestral homelands and learn about their cultural heritage. So some of these trips are organised by African Ancestry itself in partnership with African and African American travel agencies, and increasingly there's also West African companies that are taking up this initiative. One of the criticisms, as I outlined earlier, that have been made about these tests is that they seem to offer customers a link to an ethnic group with a great deal of certainty, although it's actually difficult to know when this match dates to historically. These are very old genetic lineages, so they could refer to a time scale of anywhere between 1,000 and 100,000 years. You know, the historical dating can be quite vague. So it's difficult to know whether what you receive on your DNA certificate actually refers to the historical identity of your earliest enslaved ancestor, if that's the connection that you're looking for. So conventionally, genealogists work their way back in time from the present, establishing genealogical connections from one generation to the next, whereas a DNA test could refer to a match originating over a millennium ago, well before the time of the transatlantic slave trade. But some genealogists have tried to get around this problem by cross-referencing their DNA results with other sources of information, like using onomastic analyses of their ancestors' personal names, or family lore about rituals or cultural traditions preserved in part of that part of the family, which could give clues about their particular ethnic or regional origin. So Melvin Collier, who's an African-American genealogist and the author of the book Mississippi to Africa, and of the genealogy blog Roots Revealed, he's applied these approaches, and contrary to the long-held belief that it's virtually impossible for African Americans to trace their origins beyond slavery, Collier has written that, I cite, definitive links to specific West African cultures can still be made. So in terms of the people that I interviewed in my research, lots of them hadn't engaged in this kind of very extensive and intense genealogical research and cross-referencing. But they did still show a keen interest in evaluating the authenticity of the results, and they did this using different strategies. One of the common strategies was to look for physical resemblances, or to consult African-born individuals about whether they thought they looked like members of the group they'd been matched to. And this could go either way. So one American root seeker I spoke to was attributed markers that closely aligned with the Fulani and Yoruba peoples of Nigeria. She shared the results with several Nigerian acquaintances, but the reactions were a bit skeptical. One woman told her that she couldn't see any Yoruba in her and wondered where that information had come from. And another said, "You could have Fulani in you, but you look more like Igbo to me." But on the other hand, some of the root seekers that I spoke to said that they were surprised to meet people who resembled close relatives during their trips to the countries of their genetic match, and this made them feel at home. It made them feel like they were in the right place. I should add that the DNA markers that are used by companies like African Ancestry don't have any influence on a person's physical appearance, their phenotype. And the test also doesn't account for the African ethnic mixtures relating to other parts of your family tree, which are likely to be very common in the ancestry of African descendant Americans. But even despite that, being able to pass physically for a member of the group that you've been genetically matched to is often taken as an important confirmation of the test results, because it also helps test takers feel like less of an outsider to these groups. And this is also something that Benedicta Ortfehler has described in her study of DNA-tested Americans in Ghana. But some of the more striking cases that were described to me involved moments where test takers saw not just their physical appearance, but their own personal preferences or behaviors reflected in the culture of the group they'd been matched to. So one of these examples was Juliana Luna, who was someone I spoke to who'd taken part in this 2016 documentary, Brasil DNA África, which gave DNA tests to, I think, 150 Brazilians from different parts of Brazil, self-identifying Afro-Brazilians, and then it offered to 5 of them the opportunity to go to the place they'd been genetically matched to and to explore the country and meet their kind of genetic kin. So Juliana Luna was one of these people. She's a designer, an entrepreneur, and an influencer from Rio de Janeiro, and she had her DNA tested for this documentary. She's well known in Brazil for her social engagement on issues of anti-racism and women's rights, and also for her African head wrap designs. You can see she's wearing one in this still from this YouTube video. And she explained to me in an interview that she first learned to use the head wraps while staying with a Nigerian family of Yoruba origin in the US. She found the head wraps a source of personal comfort at a difficult time, and they ended up becoming the symbol of her joint business venture, which is called Project Tribe. And in the actual documentary, Brasil DNA África, Luna is interviewed before she takes her DNA test, and she says that she's got really no expectations about the results. So she says, "I didn't want to create any expectations, to be honest, because what was will be. I am, I'm here, I exist. And it's not up to the DNA test to determine who I am, for better or for worse." But then in the next scene, when she's actually receives the report from her mitochondrial DNA test a couple of months later, the report attributes her shared ancestry with the Yoruba and the Fulani in Nigeria. And Luna is visibly shocked by the coincidence of being matched to the group from which she'd learned to make these head wraps, which had come to define her so much in terms of her persona. So as part of the documentary, she was offered the chance to travel to Nigeria and to receive a Yoruba name and Orisha. And she was told that these were the two things that she needed to be to become Yoruba in Nigerian society. And during the trip, she met the textile designer Nike Okundaye, who greeted her with the words, "Welcome home, my daughter." And Luna described her trip to Nigeria as powerful, and she said that on arriving back in Brazil, she felt that everything had changed. So depending on your perspective, Luna's story could also either speak of serendipity or of coincidence. For her, the connection with the head wraps, which were highly significant for her as a symbol of her personal development and the core of her enterprise, was very compelling. And she said that many of her friends had taken it as a sign that she was chosen for this. And Fenella Cannell has written that the accidental finding of key information is often described by genealogists as moments of serendipity, whose function is to gift you the ability to continue to connect to your dead family. And this seemed to be the kind of interpretation that that some of Luna's friends were giving this coincidence. But I want to draw attention to the fact that Luna's DNA results actually listed two different ethnic matches, so the Fulani and the Yoruba in Nigeria. And yet in the documentary, there seemed to be no question either for Luna or for the documentary crew of exploring the second link to the Fulani. So we could consider that it was the personal affinity that Luna felt for the head wraps that led her and the documentary team to choose to solidify this particular ethnic link rather than pursuing her connection to the Fulani. And it also probably helped her acceptance among Nigerians, since it spoke of her own pre-existing interest in this aspect of Yoruba culture. But at the same time, when I spoke to Luna after she'd been on this trip, she said that there were some aspects of Yoruba identity that she didn't feel able to embrace. So, for example, as someone who was brought up in the Christian tradition and who identified as non-religious, she said she wasn't prepared to become an initiate of Candomblé because she felt that she couldn't she couldn't commit to the obligations towards the Orishas, and this was something that she'd been told was necessary to becoming a Yoruba person. And far from being on a search for an ethnic identity, she told me that she'd been trying all her life to avoid defining herself as one thing or another. She saw herself as a global woman who was led above all by her sense of affinity to people and projects. But at the same time, she was aware that her DNA testing experience did lend legitimacy to her status as a designer of Yoruba-inspired head wraps in Brazil. So before her business took off, she remembered people criticizing her designs and telling her that she wasn't even African. And after having this experience with the DNA test, she said everyone was interested, and lots of people had contacted her and asked for tutorials. And again, it might not be the DNA test per se that confers this sense of legitimacy, but the journey it took her on and the connections she cultivated with Nigerian designers, I think clearly lent this sense of legitimacy to this identity that she was now assuming. And I think this is perhaps a more productive way to think about DNA ancestry matches. So to borrow from the anthropologist Jeanette Edwards, they're genetic connections that can be validated socially to differing degrees, thereby producing sometimes much yearned for, but in other times unexpected relationships. I'm aware that I'm a bit over time, so I'm just going to just quickly round up. So I've only given you one kind of detailed example here, but there were plenty of other experiences that I heard of root seekers who'd taken these tests and saw them, even though they were somewhat skeptical of the kind of historical legitimacy of the test. There were certain coincidences and resemblances that cropped up that really made them feel that there was something in the test, and that in turn contributed to this creation of or kind of strengthening of these identities. And overall, these roots trips, like the one that Juliana Luna took, are becoming more kind of popular, more institutionalized. So for African governments and communities, these practices have the advantage of stimulating tourism in the region, in West Africa in particular, giving the area an economic boost. And for this reason, some communities and local leaders have looked to invest personally and to establish direct links with DNA-tested members of the diaspora to try and encourage them to invest personally and potentially financially in the area. Just skip over that. But so this initiative called the African Royal DNA Project is a project that's connected DNA samples from, I quote, African royals, village chieftains and clan leaders, and uploaded them to commercial DNA ancestry platforms to have relative matches for diaspora and root seekers. And this also creates kind of tricky issues when if we're thinking about DNA tests as a way of trying to locate the origins of particular ancestral individuals. For example, Saidiya Hartman has argued that African monarchs were often beneficiaries of the slave trade and that enslaved people were unlikely to hail from royal lineages. But as this kind of project gathers more and more of these kind of elite lineages, it becomes more and more likely that this is the genetic match that you're going to get if you take one of these tests, even if this genetically or genealogically doesn't represent your closest relative from the time of slavery. But then again, these matches can also create unpredictable outcomes. For instance, some root seekers have used their DNA results to elicit formal apologies from African dignitaries for their historical role in the enslavement of their ancestors. And again, this also creates very complex power dynamics between diasporic root seekers and African communities. This idea of using DNA ancestry testing to stimulate links with members of the diaspora has also been heralded quite enthusiastically by some West African governments. For instance, in the early 2000s, the Ghanaian Ministry for Tourism and Diaspora Relations declared the need for a gene map of West and Central Africa to help African descendants trace their genealogy back to the region, although I'm not sure that actually came to fruition. And the government of Sierra Leone has awarded dual citizenship to some African descendants who presented genetic evidence of their link to the country and to commit to supporting Sierra Leonean society. But although these are often touted in the news and seen as kind of something that's accessible to everyone, in reality, it seems that DNA ancestry testing hasn't widely been adopted as a ground for gaining dual citizenship in the region, and doing this would, I think, be quite politically contentious, because offering someone dual citizenship without obliging them to reside in the country could aggravate conflicts over land rights, for example. And it's also unclear what kind of genetic result would be considered sufficient grounds for a citizenship claim. So most DNA admixture tests link clients to lots of ancestral regions within Africa as well as in other parts of the world. But would any proportion of genetic ancestry count, or would claimants have to demonstrate a majority of ancestry from a given country or a genealogical link to a specific ancestor? These are all things that haven't really been explored in great detail. So just before we open up to questions, to summarise, I've talked here about some of the potential and limitations of using DNA as a tool for shedding light on the identities and origins of people displaced by the transatlantic slave trade. And with regards to commercial ancestry testing, offering a link to an apparently discrete ethnic community or culture can give the sense of retrieving an identity that has remained more or less unchanged since the time of American slavery. But this obscures the genetic and cultural mixtures that occurred among African ethnic groups in the Americas, as well as among other groups, both during and since the time of slavery. And that should complicate the idea that African descendants, or anyone else really, are the inheritors of a single or pure ancestral identity. And it also simplifies the complexities of cultural identities in cosmopolitan and multi-ethnic West African nations, both today and historically, and ignores the impacts of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism in terms of shaping kinship and social structures on both sides of the Atlantic. But I've argued that it is an overstatement to claim that that using DNA to produce connections between these communities on both sides of the Atlantic is necessarily inauthentic or illegitimate. I think it's important to critically rethink the claim that genealogical links to Africa are in most cases irretrievable. And this is a claim that in places like Brazil has been used even recently to reinforce a culture of racial whitening and anti-Black racism. Of course, there are lots of ways to forge collective identities, kinship ties, and enduring social bonds that don't rely on the sharing of DNA. And sometimes genetics and genealogy aren't effective tools for producing these links to a desired ancestral community. But then again, even when it does seem to provide this key to personal identities and kinship ties, what I've seen in my research is that, like all other social bonds, these connections always have to be consolidated through mutual processes of affirmation and recognition, as well as active personal choices, even though sometimes they don't seem to be overt choices. At the same time, privileging genetic inheritance over lived experience as grounds for ethnic identity or citizenship claims is something that I think we should be very wary of. So in the case of West Africa, there's a clear desire to foster transatlantic relationships with members of the African diaspora for economic reasons and political reasons. But then the question of who you're likely to be matched to because of the way these sampling techniques have been done tends to be conditioned by socioeconomic and class factors. So for people who are hoping to follow in the footsteps of Alex Haley and identify the origins of specific ancestors, this then becomes very difficult to validate in a historical sense.